Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 781, November the 24th, 1986. I was listening to the broadcasting this morning on CNN of the hearings in Congress regarding the Iranian affair. And as they announced, not since Watergate, not since Vietnam, has there been such outright criticism of the president, and they went into the fact of the National Security Council being separate from the State Department, keeping them in the dark, making their own policies. And remember, the reason this is coming to a head now, and we're lucky it's coming to a head, is that even during Watergate and Vietnam, the National Security Council was never taken apart. It was never threatened. It developed more and more muscle. The investigators never touched it until they get rid of it and define it and limit it. It will continue to have the power it has over this country. Before I go into the national security, I quickly want to remind you of the articles, the broadcast I did on Cameroon, the explosions there, the mystery gas. I did 3 broadcasts, September 1st, 8th, and 15th, on the explosions in Cameroon when 1,800 people died. And I believe that was a testing between the United States Defense Department and Israel of the neutron bomb. And weeks after the broadcast that I had, 2.5 weeks afterwards, the London Times carried a large article about the fact that Israel had nuclear capability, nuclear arsenal, and that it also had the ability to make the neutron bomb. In the past 2 weeks, I have 18 articles on Israel, on Mordecai Vanunu, the scientist who left Israel with the pictures of the factories where the bombs are made. These articles are from the New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Examiner, Houston Post, People's World, Honolulu Star Bulletin, New York Times, and so forth, about Mr. Vanunu being taken back to Israel. He's going to face trial there for treason, but none of them mention the neutron bomb. They talk about the atomic bomb. Now, the San Francisco Examiner had just a short article. You can't even call it an article. It's one of those 2 tiny paragraph things. October the 5th, following the London Times story titled British N-Bombs Reported. Israel's been producing nuclear warheads for the past 20 years, and the article cites Mordecai Vanunu, identified as a former nuclear technician who claimed that Israel had produced a neutron bomb. And in the American press, as far as the articles I've seen, and many of you send me articles on various matters, if you see the mention of Vanunu, his trial in Israel, or any mention of the neutron bomb, send me a copy of the article or the article. Only in the San Francisco Examiner did it reprint that part that came from the London Times. Now, the London Times, a month later, has an article on Israel's problems with the exposures of the nuclear capability, and that they're moving somebody who was in charge of Vanunu security out of his job because they didn't see how he allowed him to have such a high position or take so many pictures of the plant. And the London Times says, despite a series of interviews questioning his behavior and contacts, Vanunu was able not only to gather comprehensive details about plutonium extraction and manufacture of advanced thermonuclear materials like lithium-6 and tritium used almost exclusively for the hydrogen and neutron bomb. Now, in the book The Global Manipulators, which is about the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, is written by Robert Erringer. He cites in his book on page 66-67 not only concerns that Jimmy Carter had for the National Security Council as he went in for president, that the Georgia Mafia around him, Hamilton Jordan, Jody Powell, and others were deeply distressed at Carter's involvement with Zbigniew Brzezinski. And in fact, this book goes on, in the midst of the campaign, Jordan had said to the press, if after the inauguration you find Cyrus Vance as Secretary of State and Zbigniew Brzezinski as head of the National Security Council, then I would have said we failed and I quit. And he realized that to have 2 of those would destroy anything that Jimmy Carter had, whatever he had in mind. Now, later, towards the end of the administration, Cyrus Vance did quit, and the National Security Council running the White House has been going on ever since John and Robert Kennedy were murdered, and the decisions then were put in the hands of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and then carried on through Sven Kramer as a liaison to Ronald Reagan and so forth. with their admirals and lieutenant colonels operating the National Security Council. And in that regards of the Trilateral Commission and Jimmy Carter, Erringer wrote that Carter whirled a full 180 degrees on advice from his trilateralists when in April 1978 he made the controversial decision not to deploy the neutron bomb for NATO forces. I guess it has to be made to decide not to deploy it, but he says it would not be deployed, and this was in 1978. And this book cites an article in Newsweek, April 17, 1978, denouncing Jimmy Carter as elusive, contradictory, as exasperating as ever, because he was bent on proving that he didn't want the neutron bomb, and this disappointed his friends and would help our enemies. Now, the present head of NATO now is Lord Carrington. He's on the board and co-partner with Henry Kissinger of Kissinger Associates. Alexander Haig, their protege, was out pumping for the neutron bomb in 1981 as soon as Ronald Reagan was president. Mr. Casey of the CIA was pushing Haig out to encourage our allies to receive shipments and deployments of the neutron bomb. So Casey and Haig and Carrington of NATO, and with Henry Kissinger making the policies today in and out of the various agencies, it is not difficult to believe with all of these people's long affiliations with the Mossad and Israel, and you see the links of the Carter administration from 1979-1980 sending weapons to Iran, to Khomeini, along with the Mossad and Israel. It is not hard to believe that this was in fact a test of the neutron bomb in Cameroon. The Soviet Union Pravda carried an article this week by Georgy Arbatov, A-R-B-A-T-O-V, director of the United States and Canada Institute. He said it is impossible to speak to Ronald Reagan. He's an untrustworthy ideologue. He's mouthing the Nazi propaganda of Joseph Goebbels, and he's using books that he borrowed from Goebbels for speeches that he is giving. They said since the summit has become a rabid anti-Soviet and the Kremlin can't trust his word anymore, and maybe they'll have no more dealings, the superpowers, until Reagan leaves office. Helmut Kohl of the Soviet Union was accusing Mr. Gorbachev of being like Nazi Goebbels, and Gorbachev responded instantly, and it literally said, just shut up. That's not true, and the United States is now being accused of our president using the books written by Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, to break up any conferences of peace, and it seems impossible to have discussions as long as Ronald Reagan and the people behind him are in power. On the anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, the media had their usual barrage. There was a movie on the television. I saw it. It was a 6-hour broadcast, 5 hours of witness testimony. The Monterey Herald had a story today that goes out from London and the Associated Press. Jury convicts Oswald in mock trial. A mock trial of a man accused of killing John Kennedy, shown Sunday night on British television. They convicted Oswald of murder 23 years after the assassination. The jury, in the television presence, upheld the prosecution's argument that there is no evidence to contradict the Warren Commission that Oswald is the lone assassin. And this docudrama, this 5.5-hour docudrama, was shown in this country where people were to decide on the innocence of Lee Harvey Oswald or his guilt. Now, prosecuting Lee Harvey Oswald in this 2-part program was Vincent Bugliosi. He not only prosecuted the Manson family, which wasn't hard to do, given all the evidence and motley fingerprints and admission to the various murders by each of them, but he published a book called Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter is the name of a song written by the Beatles, and it is typical of disinformation or linkage and mind control to link the Beatles to those murders that were allegedly random, that I don't think were, writing Blood on the Door, Helter Skelter, to link the Beatles, the rock musician, the hippies at that time, to these horrible murders. So Bugliosi, who titled his book Helter Skelter, which is a masterpiece of disinformation anyway, was a prosecutor. Jerry Spence from Wyoming was the defense attorney for Lee Harvey Oswald. The assistance for this came from a writer in Texas who worked with Mary Farrell. Mary Farrell is the lady who holds court RAIN in Dallas, Texas, for people that come through there, the various researchers. When I was in Texas, Penn Jones told me not to see her. He thought she was part of the intelligence community. And she had Sylvia Marr over that evening, and they wanted me to come over. And I wouldn't see either one of them. I saw Sylvia Marr in New York City. She wrote the index of the Warren Commission hearings and left out the names of the people in Texas, particularly the most important that linked to Nazi Germany, to Munich, Germany, a continuity from World War II onto where we're facing right now, these various characters that came from Munich and played a role in the murder of John Kennedy. Mary is close to Bernard Fensterwald, the CIA attorney who represented James McCord during the Watergate saga, and also Marianne Paisley, who was in charge of the Soviet desk, whose husband would be Overly Harvey Oswald of Navy intelligence when Oswald was in the Soviet Union. And Mary is close to Gordon Novell, the character that Jim Garrison wanted in New Orleans for his association and role with people involved in the murder of Kennedy. Gordon Novell is currently the control officer of John DeLorean, and those are very close friends of Mary Farrell. So that's the group that made the movie. Now, in the 5 hours, they had 21 to 24 witnesses, and that's the equivalent in 5 hours is 1 day in court. You get to court, and they'd all been sworn in. If you go to a murder trial of a court, if you come in at 9 in the morning, it closes at 4. So this trial had 5 hours of witness testimony of 24 at the most, 21 and 24 witnesses, and then you were supposed to vote. That's 1 day in court. The Warren Commission had 26 volumes of affidavits and exhibits. They had 552 witnesses. They had about 70 witnesses that should have been called, and many sitting in the room that should have been called with no cross-examination, and mentioned other persons involved. And so after the 23rd anniversary, you're supposed to know in 5 hours, with these people streaming through, that Oswald positively did it. And then to ice that juicy cake, they had 3 people, authorities on the subject, telling you their opinion of the verdict, what it should be, while you're supposed to call in and say whether Oswald's guilty or not. And Jack Anderson is there saying that Fidel Castro had John Kennedy murdered, and that mafia figure John Rosselli told him that Castro did it, and that's why Rosselli was murdered. Rosselli was murdered at the same time that the House Select Committee on Assassinations was working. He was murdered at the same time George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's closest Defense Department agent, was murdered. He was murdered at the same time that Carlos Prios Sequeiros, the former president of Cuba, who had a role in all of this, was murdered. And Rosselli was killed when he testified before the House Select Committee and gave some information about the assassination. Not that he talked to Jack Anderson, but they had other information. And then his buddy, who was supposed to testify, Sam Giancana, was murdered, and William Sullivan of Division 5 of the FBI, very instrumental in this whole operation, he was murdered. And Gary Powers, who flew the U-2 plane and suggested Oswald had a role in the Soviet Union of downing that, he was killed in a plane crash just over Santa Barbara. And there were a whole series of murders of people, at the time that Rosselli died. So Jack Anderson is saying Rosselli told him Castro did it. That's so convenient. Then Ramsey Clark, who was former Attorney General, gets on the big wide screen and says, yes, Oswald did it. Well, Martin Luther King was killed in early April 1968, and Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General, and he went immediately on TV and with the printed media news conferences that James Earl Ray did it alone. And when James Earl Ray was picked up in June, just at the time of the Robert Kennedy assassination in June of 68, a few months later, they had a suspect who had left Memphis, Tennessee, and gone all the way to London and Portugal and back to London. And on the basis of the House Select Committee on Assassination saying there was a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, and Ramsey Clark's the Attorney General saying he did it alone, he shouldn't even be on the television. So you see how slanted it was to have a man who's a proven liar talking on the television about Lee Harvey Oswald. And then they had Alan Dershowitz from Harvard, who said that he made certain points that were good about evidence being destroyed, and you can't come to a positive conclusion, actually, when evidentiary matter is destroyed, that you can't prove facts if you don't have evidence. But on the other hand, Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. So that is the 23rd anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination, and now they don't have to make a new one next year. They can bring this out every year, and you can rest assured they will. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story this week apropos of the Kennedy murder, the botched trial of Jack Ruby. And this tells about the prejudicial trial and how bad Judge Brown was, and that Ruby's lawyers asked for a new trial. And the article says Ruby's lawyers cataloged the laundry list of errors that the trial judge had committed and effectively recreated the atmosphere of hate that pervaded in the Dallas jail during the trial. Even the conservative court saw the manifest injustice of forcing Ruby to stand trial in Dallas on October 5th, 1966. They unanimously overturned his conviction and his death sentence. It took presiding Judge W.A. Morrison 10 succinct paragraphs to hold that Ruby's confession was not spontaneously made, that it should be excluded. So they set a date for the new trial. The new trial, the appeals court ordered, was to be held in North Texas town of Wichita Falls in the spring of 1967. 3 months after Ruby won his appeal for a new trial, he died at Parkland Hospital. And so that was just 3 months before he could open his mouth, and he was talking about the Nazis and the fascists in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now, with regards to the Kennedy assassination, Freedom magazine, this last issue, December 86, had a short article, or I guess you'd call it an editorial, by Jim Garrison, the renowned district attorney. He lives in New Orleans. He's a judge now at the present time, who had the courage to open up the Kennedy assassination saga and arrest Clay Shaw, and all the CIA and Defense Department came down on him and forced the case not to be solved, and Clay Shaw was legally declared innocent. But Jim Garrison has worked on this case and is the only person I know from that standpoint who has gone extensively into the far-right Nazi fascist links of Clay Shaw and the intent purposes of killing John Kennedy and the motives for doing it. I want to share with you what he said in Freedom, because some of you don't get the magazine, and it is pertinent to the National Security Council, which is a matter I'm going on to in a few moments and detail with you. I was going into the Philippine money connections, but because of the hearings on the National Security Council, I'll use that material today. Jim Garrison said, if we are to understand and bring under control the forces which are shaping today's America and are endeavoring to shape our future, we cannot rest with the official version of the killing of John Kennedy. If we cannot have the truth once and for all about the government's murder of John Kennedy, if the warfare interests in our government are so powerful that they cannot be questioned about such things, then let us have an end to the pretense that it is a government by the people. If the American people choose to do nothing about what it was done to John Kennedy and about the subtle conversion of their country from a democracy into a thinly disguised version of the warfare state, then the Republic is lost and we shall never see it again in our time. And keep in mind what I was saying, the article in Pravda this week about the United States being impossibly tilted towards war and warmongering to the extent of using the speeches from Adolf Hitler's persons. Garrison said, in any event, we need no longer pretend there's any mystery left about the assassination of John Kennedy. The Cold War is the biggest business in America, worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year, as well as tremendous power to men in Washington. The president was murdered because he was genuinely seeking peace in a corrupt world. As tired as we are of the horror of the subject, all of us must address ourselves honestly to the meaning and implications of the assassination of Kennedy, or all of us will pay the price and live in tyranny. The killing of a president by a high level of government, and this, as I mentioned before, is the National Security Council, in that highest level, is a coup d'etat. The coup d'etat is nearly unheard of in America. In European history, is replete with the elimination of national leaders by immediate subordinates. That is why the Europeans quickly sensed what was happening, and Americans showed virtually no comprehension whatsoever. Even the untimely reversal of Kennedy's policies in regard to Vietnam, while he was still laying in state at the Capitol, failed to generate the slightest spark of curiosity in the United States. A successful coup d'etat affects not merely the history of the nation, but may change its entire power structure. And as I'll cite in a few moments, the power that has gone to the national security since Kennedy is dead. He said, with the killing of John Kennedy, the very position of the presidency was drastically reduced in status. And I have to divert again to what's happening to Reagan now and the analysis of him just on the news these current days. Garrison said, henceforth the president would be a broker for the war machine. He would be an advocate and spokesman for the Pentagon. All presidents who followed Kennedy would have to know their impotence, no matter what the public role. Until the work of the Kennedy assassination is undone, presidents will come and go, and the warfare machine and its extensive intelligence tentacles, domestic as well as foreign, remain in control. The assassination reduced the President of the United States to a transient official, a servant of the warfare conglomerate. His assignment is to speak as often as possible about the nation's desire for peace, while he serves as a business agent in Congress for the military hardware and the manufacturing of the military. The assassination resulted in insulating people from the decision-making policies and the foreign policies of peace or war. And you see this separation of the policies of this national security from, digressing from Garrison, saying the separation of the national security from the State Department, the Congress, and even the President. Sometimes they were making the decisions, and some of those he wasn't even told for a while. Garrison said, prior to the assassination, in accordance with the Constitution, the President made decisions with regard to foreign policy. Then the Senate approved or disapproved treaties, and then Congress decides whether or not we go to war. There were good reasons for the system. In each instance, the decision was made by men who were elected by the people. And these are not the Poindexters, North, and Singlaubs that you never see, or the Eagleburgs, or the Scowcrofts, or so forth. They're elected by the people. Garrison said the rifle shots in Dealey Plaza removed these vital powers from the elected officials and made them readily available to the warfare apparatus. As a result, after Kennedy, although most Americans were opposed to the war in Asia, it went on and on. The foreign policy went on, being that made by the Pentagon and by the Central Intelligence Agency. When a counter-revolution is occurring and a low-level intelligence employee is being prepared for sacrifice to draw attention away from the power elite, they are sponsoring a forthcoming assassination. It is perhaps old-fashioned to speak of the injustices being dealt to the scapegoat. Nevertheless, the observation has to be made that the inhumanity demonstrated by the CIA and the masked eminence for whom it performed was scarcely distinguishable from the inhumanity of the totalitarian governments we defeated in World War II. Actually, we had taken the place of the totalitarian powers who we defeated, and after our 2 decades as a superstate during the years of the Cold War, we became a different country. And it is those 2 decades I'll refer to later in some other articles. To be sure, Jim Garrison said, of all the revered symbols of America, they kept those to cover up what is happening, singing the Star-Spangled Banner, the president throwing the first baseball season, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in school. But changes had occurred in America. It happened as silently as the moon sliding behind the clouds. With the advent of our special brand of benevolent imperialism, we had acquired secret police, an integral part of the warfare state, secret police not only around the globe but within our own country as well. It was in the name of national security, but in the name of national security, the warfare state commits its worst crimes against humanity. What was important above all was that the newer power structure of our country is no longer the one originally contemplated by the Constitution. Lip service continued to be paid to the importance of the individual and his rights and the greatness of democracy and the leadership of the free world. However, the center of gravity of power in America has long since fallen into the control of the warfare interests, and all the signs of a free society which were still exhibited on every hand were garlands, tinselled ornaments to keep the populace happy. The real test of whether a country still belonged to the people was what happened to national leaders who called for an end to the Vietnam War or removal of the troops from Asia. They were all shot to death by ostensibly lone assassins, men who every case had remarkable records of international travel. They were also given cancer and thrown out of buildings and dropped dead on the streets of poisoning to get rid of these particular people. John Kennedy was going to be executed because he was the one who stood in the way of the continued power of the superstate and continued growth of the empire. Oswald was executed promptly afterwards because somebody had to be seized and killed to turn the eyes of the people away, to halt at the very outset the beginning of thought. The singular value of intelligence employee as a scapegoat was the fact that such agents go where they are told. This is like get your job at the book depository or go to the airport and get your job there. Do what you're told, and you can easily be set up so as to appear to be a violent leftist assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald handing out Marxist material for Cuba for Fidel Castro in front of the Trade Mart in New Orleans. Jim Garrison says that high government officials knowingly and using electronic media would do the rest, and a whole new chapter of history is written, created out of the purest gossamer fabric, spun out of the trust of people and the duplicity of their leaders. It is 23 years since Kennedy was assassinated, and the model officially presented by the government has sagged and finally collapsed under the weight of its cumbersome lies. Nor is there any sign that the hope that succeeding administrations have any interest in seeing the truth or making it available. The fact that the same men continue to run the Pentagon, the CIA, and the FBI that helped to conceal the CIA's handiwork after the assassination indicates that the war-oriented interests are in firm control, and nothing more can be expected from this government except more untruth and war. Now, interestingly enough, while the jury of the Kennedy trial, the Oswald trial, was out, people could call in and say whether or not they thought Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty or innocent. And in the East Coast and in the Midwest and on the West Coast, the tallies were almost identical. 85 to 86% of the people didn't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did the assassination alone, that he was involved with somebody else or didn't do it at all. But 85 to 86% was the national opinion on this story, which shows that that jury was using a handful of 24 at the most witnesses that were handpicked to present a weak case in 5 hours, and that people out at large are much smarter. Now, the secret or the important thing to do is to get activity to open up this case, the material that's locked up, and re-examine it without the old people re-examining again, without bringing in people like G. Robert Blakey, and have real evidence on the table. Incidentally, speaking of covert actions and the way this country was overthrown, there's an article from the LA Times this morning on Corazon Aquino and her problems in the Philippines, and one of the political parties there, the National Democratic Front, is saying that these problems that she's having are developed by the imperialist conspiracy backed by the United States CIA. The plot, they asserted, was ultimately aimed at forcing Washington hardline counterinsurgency strategy on Corazon Aquino, and as proof, Ocampo cited the background of Ramos and Aledo, who are now running the military in the Philippines. They're both graduates of West Point. They served with the American Armed Forces, and they're both experts in psychological warfare. And just a few weeks ago, John Singlaub and his troop from the National Security Council were in the Philippines, which supports this statement. And I hoped I'd get to Singlaub in the Philippines today, but I will, put that off until next week. Now, the Washington Post has a story today, the 24th of November, by Bob Woodward about our excuses for going into Iran and arming Iran, and how Ronald Reagan, again, using the advice of the National Security Council, had a new law, a secret intelligence law formed that gives the CIA authority to interfere in the affairs of a foreign government, the national security, which they're not supposed to do, and their purpose was to shape the behavior of Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor. So again, we're going into the mind control way of shaping the way they think in Iran, in the Philippines, and all over the world, based upon the expertise of those people from the National Security Council. The Woodward article says that the covert operations give the CIA and the National Security Council and the White House primary role in attempting to manage and develop U.S. foreign policies towards Iran or elsewhere. Informed sources describe CIA Director William Casey as a strong supporter of the covert plan involving paramilitary actions, CIA support such as with the Contras, traditionally done by our State Department and other agencies and Defense Department, being handled by the White House by the secret group of the National Security Council, who write new laws and give themselves new powers and then proceed to affect the mind and the psyche of the leaders and the military of these huge countries. So they're operating at a mind control as well as a military way inside this little office with a handful of people who aren't elected and not identified. They're identified now for the first time, but for the most part, they've kept themselves pretty secure. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I want to go back to the National Security Council and Ronald Reagan and the problems that are happening right now. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of broadcast number 781. In case you missed the first part of this program, I'm talking about the National Security Council, the power it has had over our country since World War II, and the hearings going on in Congress now about that power and the decision-making process taken away from the Congress as the Constitution decided it should be balanced, a subject that I've been talking about for years that is finally coming to the attention of members of Congress. The Monterey Herald had a story this morning. National Security Council's power has grown over the past decades, and it explains how Ronald Reagan could go into Iran 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, and the point it makes is that the position held by Zbigniew Brzezinski in the Carter administration upgraded the National Security Advisor, and it gave more power to the national security. After John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were murdered, Henry Kissinger came in, and the old party politics was over, and as National Security Director, the power that was written into the book sneakily in 1947 could be used that would bypass Congress. This article says President Nixon stepped up the process, appointing Henry Kissinger to the post and combining the National Security Advisor's staff with that of the National Security Council. Nixon said in his memoirs that Kissinger recommended that I structure a national security apparatus within the White House that, in addition to coordinating foreign and defense policy, could also develop options for me to consider before making decisions. And this is the protege of the faceless Fritz Kramer, the partner of Daniel Graham of High Frontier. And after Nixon got to office, after his opponent in 1960, John Kennedy, was murdered, and his opponent in 1968, Robert Kennedy, was murdered, his electoral opponents, he was in, and Kissinger was the advisor, and then it became important that Kissinger move his offices and his advice into the White House, and that's where the foot really got in the door. Under this system, Kissinger dominated and eventually succeeded Secretary of State William Rogers. Even though they're close friends and William Rogers is on the board of Kissinger Associates, this was the transition of moving this power to Brzezinski and Kissinger, one from Poland and one from Germany, under Fritz Kramer from Germany, and a family that goes back to chemicals, IG Farben, and Nazi Germany, moved into American intelligence, and then picked up Henry Kissinger, who moves into this position. Through the process of these political murders, they got their power. The San Francisco Chronicle was talking about the end of the road for two persons from the National Security Council, and the interesting thing is that if they're scapegoats to fall, as Jim Garrison referred to, they get rid of their own patsies or scapegoats. Kissinger and Haig come out of this whole thing smelling like a rose, and if you haven't noticed it, watch television. I've taped the last 2 weeks, and Kissinger and Haig are the recipients of the accolades, and Haig is ready to run for president, and the others can be moved aside when they're caught. The Chronicle says that Navy Vice Admiral John Pondexter and Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North can't count on as resuming active service if the Iran arms hostage uproar ends their tenure with the National Security Council. Both have made enemies at the Pentagon during their White House duty, and their military careers are dead end. That's because they work for those secret armies and not in the established Pentagon, which they came through, but were put into a position separate from the Marines and the Pentagon with this other secret team. And that's why Alexander Haig jumped over 243 other persons to become a general. He didn't mingle with his classmates and work his way up. There was a story, front page story from the LA Times and Chronicle today, pressure for shakeup around Ronald Reagan. Critics take sharper aim at Schultz. And this is the important thing about this, and it was on television last week, yesterday, Sunday, referring to the NBC Meet the Press. And Meet the Press is run by Marvin Kalb. He is the protege of Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. Marvin and Bernard Kalb are always around Kissinger, writing books about him, traveling with him. So Marvin Kalb gives Henry Kissinger a chance to talk about the Iranian crisis. And this is the quote in the newspaper. Republicans and Democrats, as well as former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, were directly or implicitly critical of George Shultz and in favor of bringing wiser men into the White House as presidential aides. Wiser men, meaning old Kissinger himself. This is a quotation of Kissinger. I am struck that in the middle of a crisis, the president is all alone on a parapet and almost none of his close associates are supporting him, not just on tactics, not even on general philosophy. Kissinger said on the NBC Meet the Press, the Secretary of State should support his president in a crisis. In the end, it is the duty of the Secretary of State to get along with the president and not the president to get along with the Secretary of State. Now, this is Henry Kissinger saying, I feel so sorry for you. Nobody sticks by you. And at the time of Watergate, he was in the Lincoln Room while poor Richard Nixon was on his knees praying and slobbering about relatives or family or crisis. And he was there, holding his hand, and he set up the White House plumbers, the wiretapping, the bugging, the overthrowing of this country with the whole Watergate operations, with Alexander Haig moving in to take Robert Haldeman's job as Secretary of State and always willing to be in charge of the country when Reagan was shot in 1981. The Vicar of Washington, Alexander Haig. So on Sunday television, you get Henry Kissinger saying, you really need the wise man, I'm available if you need me, just quietly or secretly, and denouncing Schultz and saying, here's your poor president all alone, and anyone should support the president. Also, there was a story in the Andrew Jack Anderson column today about California mafia is missed. Donald Reagan's tenure with the White House staff has left the Reagan's old friends in California and the henchmen around Donald Reagan confused, and they no longer have influence and policy options. Instead, Ronald Reagan is held literally, this is what Jack Anderson said, by a power grab by Donald Reagan, that the solution to problems is worked out with a yes or no decision, that they give him a yes or no, and he has to say it, and usually he goes along with Reagan. The president okays a suggestion. So that the power comes down to Ronald Reagan, through Reagan, the former Secretary of the Treasury under this president, who literally took over. If you saw him at the hospital when President Ronald Reagan had surgery, he took over, sets up his headquarters, and so forth. Well, there was an interesting background on Donald Reagan that you don't see very often in Executive Intelligence Review, December 13th, and this article by Kathleen Klinetsky claims that when Robert McFarlane left the National Security Council December 4th, 1985, and that's while they were deep into the Iranian processes, the balance of power in the Reagan administration dangerously was shifted against the national interests of the United States, and in the White House put into the head of the Chief of Staff, Donald Reagan, along with Secretary of State Schultz, who he claimed worked with Reagan up to this point, and that they were running every aspect of the economic policy, U.S. foreign policy, and strategic policy, along with Treasury Secretary James Baker. And this article tells how President Reagan has abandoned day-to-day involvement in the running of the government. He leaves his decisions to Donald Reagan, and Czech Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger is hanging by the post by his fingernails. This is December last year. And Donald Reagan has Admiral John Poindexter running the show, and Donald Reagan, and they literally are isolating the president and giving him orders. and that Reagan and Baker work with Federal Chairman Paul Volcker, and they're consolidating economic policy in their hands. And this article is about the dangerous combine of economic policy and foreign policy controlled by Donald Reagan. And the article is, the one subtitle is CZAR Reagan Makes His Move. Donald Reagan himself, not known for false modesty, told the New York Times December 5th that he views his role now as the bridge and counsel to the president on foreign policy, and that he is the one who will be making it and bringing it to him. And again, this is from the Kramer, Fritz Kramer, Daniel Graham, on down Henry Kissinger and Haig policy. The article goes on, Reagan is a prominent Catholic. He's part of a nest of self-styled prominent conservative Catholic laymen, which include shipping magnate J. Peter Grace, head of the American Knights of Malta, and George S. Moore of First Bank, Boston Bank, as well as former Secretary of State Alexander Haig and ex-Treasury Secretary Bill Simon. All of them Haig, Simon, Moore, Grace, all Knights of Malta. These gentlemen hired the services of Michael Novak, another Knight of Malta, recent resident Catholic at the influential American Enterprise Institute, to concoct stories of influencing national policy, economic policy, and so forth. And the article goes on that Reagan's close personal friend, the right-wing J. Peter Grace, has close family associates and businesses in the areas where foreign policy is made in Central America and around the country, and that Donald Reagan is making foreign policy and is closely linked to William Simon, Alexander Haig, George Moore, and J. Peter Grace, and that the influence in foreign policy is coming out of these people. Now, that is pretty heavy stuff. The Wall Street Journal had an article just this morning, Reagan's distrust of the establishment helped create his troubles over Iran. And in essence, what they're saying today goes back to the influence of the National Security Council in taking over the decisions of Reagan. It said Ronald Reagan's foreign policy is in deep trouble because it is too homemade, which it isn't. It comes out for the Center of Strategic International Studies out of Georgetown. The Iran affair is devastating because it reveals the administration's naivete about Iranian policies. It is devastating because it reveals an impatient White House that dismissed the opinions of its own experts and its allies and bypassed Congress and hornswaggled the public. And this, again, is that secret SISMI, the secret group that Michael LEDEEN ran with Francesco Pazienza and Haig and Kissinger in Italy and in this country and goodness knows how many other countries. The article from the Wall Street Journal says, even after the fact, the administration has circled its wagons, tried to mount a public relations campaign. Instead of reaching to Congress and press and the public, the elected officials or so forth, Reagan has adopted the style of his chief of staff, Don Reagan. The real problem is deeper than the administration's mistakes or the attempt to explain them. It is Reagan's inner circle's contempt, and this is the key, for the past foreign policies, the people who made them, and the bureaucracies that carried them out. From the time that John Kennedy was murdered in 1960, this isn't in the article, this is Mae interjecting in here, through that time period up till Ronald Reagan was in power, and starting with Richard Nixon, this team had full control. They were gaining control when Nixon was exposed at Watergate, and they were in tight with Ronald Reagan. Getting back to the Wall Street Journal, it says Mr. Reagan set out in 1981, when he was president, to change American foreign policy, not to management. He came to power convinced that the pillars of American diplomacy for the past 2 decades, that's 20 years, back to Kennedy, such as arms control and the pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union, were rusted and rotting. These policies had to be replaced and not just refurbished. He spurned experts from the mainstream of American foreign policy, from the center of his own party. He surrounded himself with the old friends from California, conservative ideologues who had been flocking in the banner since Goldwater's campaign in 1964. The administration discarded most of the people who managed strategic policy in this country for the last 20 years, said Richard Haass, a former Reagan State Department official who teaches at Harvard. The president is not hearing mainstream strategic advice, so he turns to radical ideas. He and his inner circle discovered they don't want to count on professionals at the State Department, at the Defense Department, at the Central Intelligence Agency. They want to convert Reagan to their ideas, and this is the Georgetown Center of Strategic and International Studies that has grabbed this president for theirs and went immediately into the evil empire. We won't talk with you, we hate you, and created incidences that we could blame the Soviet Union on, such as the Korean airline downing that, to get the weapons that these people want and need, the deployment of atomic missiles, of neutron bombs, and so forth. The Wall Street Journal says, we asked the State Department for 2.5 years to find somebody to talk about Iran, according to the White House officials, and they didn't want to go along with what we were doing. So the administration cooked up their secret diplomacy with Iran, which was devised by Robert McFarlane, John Poindexter over the objections, and not behind the back of Secretary Shultz and Weinberger, who knew about it. After Congress took the CIA off the case, Mr. Reagan's policy towards Nicaragua was run for 2 years out of the White House, and they'll have to get onto that after they do Iran, that they have been running the White House. Now, in 1981, Covert Action had an article by Fred Landis titled "The Right's Revenge, the Spies and Reagan Victory, the October 22nd Movement." And this is very important to understand the way these people manipulated the elections, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the murder of Salvador Allende, the killing of political leaders, and getting Ronald Reagan to office. And he was only in office, sworn in January, and this article was written in April 1981, called the October 22nd Movement. And then if I have time later, or maybe next week, I'll go into Don Fried's article. A friend, a long listener to World Watchers, reminded me was in the same Rebel article that I wrote for Rebel in November, this 1983. Don Fried's story, A Question of Treason, how Ronald Reagan sabotaged the Iranian hostage rescue mission. The Iranians knew we were coming. This is an important story of how elections are won or manipulated, and how the intelligence community, the Georgetown Center that runs the National Security Council, affects the candidates in office, and how they manipulated to get them into office and finally got Ronald Reagan. This article by Fred Landis, as I say, was written in April 1981. He says the election of Ronald Reagan, November 4th, 1980, was not only a victory for the moral majority, in many respects, the long-planned triumph of a cabal of renegade intelligence officers dissatisfied with trends in foreign policy and manifested themselves during the Carter administration. And the target of this group, this cabal, and I don't agree that just renegade, I think that they're a tight-knit group that does use our agencies, and the agencies know it. The target of the group wasn't just the White House, which is now under the control of Donald Reagan, as I say, but most important, congressional committees that supervise foreign policy and the administration's transition team for foreign policy. The group, comprised of former CIA officers and agents, would run from the back rooms of the Defense Department and manipulate the foreign policies and the defense teams that would be appointed by the president after the Ford and Carter years. Some of the intelligence officers were forced to retire after Senator Frank Church's investigation of the intelligence communities, but they operate out of 3 interrelated Washington-based organizations, and these are the ones that are the backbone of the operations of the national security. One is the initials are AFIO, the Former Intelligence Officers, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. The other is the Center of Strategic and International Studies, and the third is the Heritage Foundation. One tip-off that an intelligence operation was taking place under cover of the electoral campaign when Jimmy Carter ran against Ronald Reagan was the term disinformation. It's an intelligence word that describes overt attempt to manipulate informational environment of a selected target group by such actions as planted stories, selected leaks, rumors, forged documents, in this case, the election campaign. They couldn't shoot the Jimmy Carter and let Ronald Reagan come in successfully after Robert and John Kennedy were killed. So the disinformation campaign was used in order to manipulate the current president into office. And the article cites examples of disinformation about Billy Carter that was managed by Michael LEDEEN, the Cartergate stories, and Michael LEDEEN set up the meetings in Iran, of Robert McFarlane as an agent of the Mossad, working with them. This article says hundreds of articles were planted to create artificial crisis atmosphere, that the Soviets were a threat to the United States, that they were planning World War III, that they back international terrorism, that they have moles in the CIA, that they have penetrated the United States media. To promote the disinformation, there was Robert Moss and Arnaud de Borchgrave. He, since this article was written, became the editor of Reverend Moon's Washington Times, and they used techniques and disinformation through the entire electoral process to get Ronald Reagan in. Now, the editor of Heritage Publications was Robert Moss, who was instrumental with CIA disinformation in Chile when Salvador Allende was murdered and the government was overthrown. And the editor of the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies was their chief disinformation in Italy in 1976, and later we saw with the CZAR at the time of the Pope shooting in the 80s, it was Michael LEDEEN. And Robert Moss and Michael LEDEEN became the experts on Euro-communism, Euro-neutralism, and terrorism, and so forth, coming out of the Georgetown Center and working Robert Moss with the Heritage Group, LEDEEN with the Georgetown Center, de Borchgrave, and then after the elections of Reagan, moving into the Times. The most virulent elements within this brotherhood of persons manipulating the country, the October 22nd movement it's called, included David Atlee Phillips, who headed the institution or organization of retired agents, Richard Helms, who was our ambassador to Iran and who destroyed the records on mind control that the government was examining or hoped to examine. He was deputy of the CIA and then became a CIA director. Richard Nixon was part of the inner team. Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and the late Thomas Karamessines and Ray Cline. Cline is very much involved with John Sing Laub right now in the Philippines and down with the Contras and with every covert action that the National Security Group or this inner team have done. Ray Cline is part of it. And, of course, as soon as Nixon was in and Kennedy was murdered, then Kissinger could restructure the National Security Agency. David Atlee Phillips, Richard Helms, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and Thomas Karamessines and Ray Cline. And this article states that the history of secrecy and deception in the United States policy over the last decade is largely the history of these individuals. And I bring it up now, this article that was written in 1981, because Kissinger wants to become the advisor again. Haig wants to run for president. Richard Nixon is being glorified and touted around as a great person in foreign relations and foreign policies. Richard Helms is on national television. These people have not faded away, and no matter what the fights are in the White House now, whether it's McFarlane or Poindexter or North and so forth, these people stay on top and nobody can touch them. No matter what you do, they are not touchable, and they have been in power since the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King were killed, and since heads of other countries were killed, and they have their power today. This article says, examining the secret wars they had in Chile, Cuba, Vietnam, with Watergate, where they removed the president at that time, in Iran, or in the 1980 election campaign. They used the date October 22nd as a starting point. The article says, behind his desk, in a gold calendar commemorating this date, placed there by President Kennedy, this is for the CIA director, as an award for the CIA's role during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The date Kennedy and the CIA felt that they had regained the honor they had lost in the Bay of Pigs. And this article goes on to tell how the Cuban Missile Crisis was created by David Phillips of the intelligence community for his own use and for the United States, and the role it had in the murder of John Kennedy. The article says, Robert Moss is the hitman for the October 22nd movement now in 1981, as he was earlier in Chile. Moss, the author of a CIA finance book about Chile, that in itself is not saying a great deal. The CIA admitted to financing over 1,200 books and some categories such as Chile under Allende. Of all the covert operations uncovered during the Senate investigations in 1975-76, the most secret and most sensitive, it touched all the nerve spots: CIA assassinations, CIA disinformation, CIA use of the media. Only 7 individuals had prior knowledge to all of this. And this was David Atlee Phillips, Richard Helms, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, Thomas Karamessines, and Ray Cline. There are many examples of the significance of the October 22nd movement, and incidentally, they cite October 22nd, 1970 in Santiago, Chile, the date that the chairman of the Chilean Joint Chief of Staff, General Rene Schneider, was assassinated, and it was the first political assassination in Chile, and it set the date later for the assassination of Salvador Allende when they got rid of Mr. Schneider. The other dates on October 22nd, they refer to David Atlee Phillips, who was behind the Cuban Missile Crisis. A great deal of information has come out about his activities. And before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the man interviewing him, Gates Alfonsi, later wrote an article in Washington Magazine, and he tells about Mr. Phillips and how a person working with him in Cuba recognized him in Dealey Plaza after John Kennedy was killed. A particular witness, Mr. Veciano, saw Bishop in Dallas in Texas in September 1963, pardon me, not the day Kennedy was killed, but saw him with Lee Harvey Oswald in September 1963 and felt that David Atlee Phillips had a role in this particular assassination. He sued a lot of people who said that, but just seeing with Oswald doesn't mean he had a role, but he was in charge of a lot of disinformation information at the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Phillips was chief of covert action in Mexico City. He was in charge of the Cuban operations. Fonsi spoke of notes about his relationship with the Alpha 66, created for President Kennedy before, during, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those activities were planned by Maurice Bishop. They became the notorious anti-Castro Cubans and were, and this article goes into the relationship of them to disinformation to embarrass Kennedy publicly and to move him against Fidel Castro, which Mr. Veciano now admits was done to instigate and put us on the brink of war with Russia, and also later to try and embarrass Kennedy. They also notice that Bishop has a morbid sense of history or historical irony. This article says he selects the dates for operations based on the anniversary of some psychologically important date, such as October 21st or October 31st. Now that's interesting because I see coincidences of names and dates and don't think they're coincidences at all. They cite the October 22nd, 1972 truckers' strike in Chile that was set up by the Central Intelligence Agency that called for the resignation of Allende. It was David Phillips' Operation Instructions and Assembly that did that. October 20th, 1973 was the Saturday Night Massacre at the Watergate when Alexander Haig fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox on the orders of Nixon, and Haig was Chief of Staff. October 31st, 1974, the assassination of Carlos Prats. General Pratt had been General Snyder's successor under Allende while in exile in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His car was blown up by Michael Townley and Juan Bolnes. Bolney was indicted, and Townley walked off later to have a role in murdering Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in Washington. And October 31st, 1977, the Helms plea in the Halloween massacre, the day that Richard Helms pleaded no contest in federal court, that he had lied under oath, got a slap on the wrist, that he was involved with CIA activities in October of 70. And the date, October 22nd to October 31st, is cited in this article over and over. And the important thing is that these persons named, like David Atlee Phillips, Richard Helms, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and Alexander Haig, and the late Thomas Karamazine, are very important, and Ray Cline, into the very activities you see in Iran today, the role of these people, and in Central America, Nicaragua, and so forth. The article describes David Phillips as retired from the CIA in 1975 when he formed the Association for Former Intelligence Officers and has contact with them and lobbies full-time for the CIA. Ray Cline was director of research at Georgetown Center. He's still there. He was on television telling about his friendship with Reinhard Gehlen one evening at the time of some hearings regarding Nazis and the Defense Department. He is in charge of research at Georgetown Center. As I said, a large number of the CIA, National Security Agency, and State Department warriors are in residence right at Georgetown Center. It is the home for the people and associates that are moving into the Reagan administration and having control over the intelligence and national security transitional teams. This was written in 1981, and in 1986 you see, in fact, how they did it. The Georgetown Center harbors many of the top officials of national security apparatus particularly at the time of the Chile campaign, including Henry Kissinger. This article goes on to say Richard Nixon has recently been credited, this is in 1981, as the architect for the selection of Alexander Haig as Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, and pulled from this same group from the National Security, the protege, again, of Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger. And this Georgetown Center is so important. I don't want to brush off these people quickly because each one of them deserves an hour of description by themselves. But this was written in 1981, I repeat again, and this was an article that came out just 2 months after Ronald Reagan took office, and these are the people that are being examined now before Congress finally about who makes foreign policy, but even their names aren't thrown out. They're protected, and you hear the name Schultz, or you hear the name Weinberger, or you hear the name Poindexter, or you hear North, or you hear McFarland, but you don't hear the top people above who can bring in other people to take their place. I am running out of time now and have to conclude. I want to go back to this article again and finish it next week. It's very, very important, describing what was happening in Washington in 1981 and then what is happening now. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week and to continue along these lines of the people behind the Congress and the presidency who really runs America. Information.